What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an update on Solasta 2, which I last talked about towards the end of October 2025, I believe, as it had just recently gotten a showcase as part of the Galaxy show that took place back then. That said, since that showcase, we have been sort of drip-fed new information via community updates and the like, and I wanted to sit down and basically compile all of that different information into a proper update for people, as individually a lot of these details weren't particularly large. Now, a few of these have been known for a little while, but I wanted to pack as much in here as I could, given that the early access start date is actually coming up pretty soon, which is probably as good a place as any to start. The official date for the early access start is in fact March 12th, so not too much longer to go, a little under 2 months. But obviously that's just the tip of the iceberg, because we also have a bunch of details about that early access period itself. I would say the probably most important bit of information that we don't know right now is actually the price of it, however. We know there's supposed to be some supporter pack or whatever, and then obviously the early access itself will have a price, which will be cheaper than the full game launch as they work through that process, as is the usual, mind you. Probably also worth a mention that this is going to be a Steam thing and that they do not have the console release planned until 1.0. In terms of what to actually expect, however, they've already stated that the character creator will be available for people, and while we won't have access to every single option, we should be able to get the gist of it. As usual with these types of games, we'll also be able to pick from just pre-made characters, and then I would imagine, just like Solasta 1, there's likely going to be an option to save preset characters that you have already made the next time you start up a campaign, things like that. Now, in terms of races, we've got human, elf, dwarf, and halfling that will be available right away, and they did mention that more will be coming in future early access updates. We don't have the full list of what they have in mind here. My personal hope is that they are going to add in the sort of almost Oriad type of individuals that we saw as part of the publicly available demo that is already out right now that you could check out if you wanted to, but we'll see how that winds up going. Now, in terms of classes, this is stuff we already knew as well, but fighter, cleric, wizard, rogue, sorcerer, and paladin will be available straight away. The game is, if you just somehow didn't know, I guess, using Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and so their goal with early access updates until 1.0 is to get all 12 of the sort of base D&D 5e classes available. But we did get a little bit of new information here, which is that at the start of early access, most of these classes will have two subclasses, one coming in from Solasta 1 with some balance changes, and then another subclass unique to Solasta 2. The exception here is actually going to be Cleric, which is going to have 3 subclasses that were already available in Solasta 1. Now, on the exciting news there, I guess, is that multi-classing will be available straight away. Though, truth be told, you probably won't be able to do much with it, because at the start of early access, the initial level cap is going to simply be level 4. Over the course of the early access and eventually into 1.0, the cap will raise up to level 10, and over the course of that period, they're going to be adding in things like class, subclass features, spells, and just kind of expanding the list as the early access period continues onward. Now, in terms of what kind of content, or at least the amount of that content you can expect in early access, the initial launch should see a portion of Act 1 available to players, which they have then estimated at about 10 to 15 hours. They did want to stress, however, that balancing and things like that is obviously still up in the air, and so the challenges and combat encounters and things that you experience as you play through it are obviously highly subject to change, given that a lot of this just is simply not set in stone just yet. Now, another update that they have given since the last time I talked about this was some details about how the world map system is going to work, and also the factions and things that inhabit it. Now, the world map in Solasta 2 will be substantially different from Solasta 1, which was extremely basic, especially in the main campaign in comparison to the DLC campaigns. The main campaign was basically just set routes to individual locations you might explore, whereas in Solasta 2 here, what they're doing is a hex-based grid system over a 3D world map. Now, this is important because you're effectively essentially going to be navigating those tiles, and this obviously has a few implications. The most simple being that you are going to move via move points and forced march points. The terrain that you're on will determine how much of these different move points that you'll actually be using, and then as you would expect with a D&D game, this also plays back into the rest system, as you need to rest basically once a day, because if you don't, you will actually be marching through the night via the game's day-night cycle, but doing this will also, of course, accrue exhaustion, which will impose huge penalties on your dice rolls, things like that. So basically, forced march can save you some time, but is obviously pretty dangerous in terms of your actual combat effectiveness. And then as you would expect with any good world map, there will of course be random encounters and like. Now, some of them will actually not be combat encounters, which is different from Solasta 1 where they were all combat, but basically they've expanded the pool there, and you should hopefully see those differences reflected in the things you actually wind up doing. But obviously we shall see what happens. Now, I mentioned a bit about those factions. So, Tactical Adventures also saw fit to explain some of the factions that we'll be encountering over the course of this adventure, starting first with the Beacon. The Beacon were basically an expedition force from the Mancalan Empire, which you would be familiar with if you've played the first game, but long story short, it's an Imperial expedition force that largely took over the continent of Neokos before the cataclysm that took place. This cataclysm effectively reduced a lot of the force that was available to the Beacon as a faction, and what they were taking by force, they had to take a step back and start trying to pursue diplomacy instead. These guys will be heading things up from their main city and fortress of Kermar. Now, in direct opposition to them, we have people like the Argad Republic. The Argad Republic are essentially free people, and what that means is a little more specific here, because these are actually the group of people that formed up around a slave revolt following the cataclysm from elsewhere. So these people, as you would probably expect, are a bit of a disorderly group that appeals a lot more to the common man than the imperial delegation trying to take over the continent. Not to be outdone, though, we then have the Combers. The Combers are essentially like a scavenger faction. They do the dirty work of exploring ruins, uncovering lost knowledge, that kind of thing, and then of course trying to sell that stuff for a profit, and they subtly imply that you may be able to find like secret passages and dungeons and things like that if you're willing to pay the Combers for the information, which is curious. And then the last one they mentioned by name was the Ka'um, I think. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but these are the indigenous peoples, it would seem, of the continent. It's a sort of loose collective of tribes that have a sizable connection to the land itself, and they are fairly nomadic in nature as well. I think the closest comparison to these guys might be something akin to barbarians with a little more magic involved, though curiously they do go on to mention that this group in particular apparently has the belief of harmonic sounds making up the universe, which sounds familiar if you're into a lot of fantasy stuff, I guess. However, they also did emphasize that that is almost certainly not going to be all of the factions that we actually encounter, mind you, just a few of the different important ones. So hopefully altogether that kind of gives you a brief outline of what to expect here, and then just as a reminder in general, you can check out the publicly available demo for yourself ahead of the launch of the early access to see if it's something you would actually want to do. Though, speaking of that early access period, other just general things that we know are going to be coming to it at some point in future updates are things like online co-op, alongside, of course, the just general content expansions of locations, monsters, quests, things like that you would expect. And so, all in all, speaking for myself at the very least, this has me excited to jump into the early access period for this one. I hope it is actually a productive one, and we ultimately get to provide a lot of feedback to what seems to be a very large jump and improvement in terms of quality, and I would say overall scope from the original Solasta. Either way, however, we won't have too much longer to wait on that, given that this early access launch is less than 2 months away now, and hopefully you're looking forward to me covering that as well. And to that end, if you want to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, I'll be certain to cover this as soon as it drops into that, or I get any access to it, that kind of thing. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.